Today we have Alex Newman with us. He's an award-winning investigative journalist, writing for a variety of publications internationally. He's also an educator, author, and a consultant. Primarily, he serves as a foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine. Today, Alex, who has written extensively on the Chinese Communist Party, is going to give us an insight into the foreign relations policies carried out by the United States towards China during and after World War II, and how officials within the United States government during that time helped create the Chinese Communist Party that we live with today. And this is all prefaced with a book that has just been reprinted. The original title in 1952 was May God Forgive Us, America's Betrayal of China to the Communists. The updated title is, again, May God Forgive Us. So Robert Welch, the author of the book, who spent most of his life trying to educate the public on the threat communism posed, sought to warn us of the infiltration of pro-communist and Maoist individuals within our own government. Here is the interview. I hope you enjoy. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us. So my first question would be, why did Robert Welch see a communist China as a threat? And this was during the era of World War II, from 1930s to 1950s, is primarily when he was dealing with this issue and writing this book. And so how or why did U.S. officials, in his words, betray China to the communist bloc?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program, Tim. It's great to be with you again. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on these questions. I mean, these questions are so important, and they're probably more relevant today than maybe ever, because, with the rise of communist China that we see now, this regime is becoming incredibly important, incredibly influential. To give you a sense of just how far they've taken over the institutions of global governance, just consider that 4 out of 15 UN specialized agencies are literally run right now by members of the Communist Chinese Party. Only one of those 15 agencies is run by an American. And the Chinese are now training thousands and thousands of diplomats at their School of Global Governance at Beijing Foreign Service University to literally take over the machinery of global governance. So this is an incredibly important topic. And the threat is very real. One of the reasons Robert Welch viewed the threat as so significant is because of China's population. I mean, it is the most populous country in the world at about 1.4 billion people. And so, the Soviet Union was deadly enough, was dangerous enough all on its own. But then when they added China to the slave empire of communism, they literally added manpower that is unprecedented in human history to this effort to enslave humanity. And so that's why it's so significant. And, we see what that's producing today in terms of communist China being groomed to take over the architecture of global governance and what the globalists often refer to as the New World Order. I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later. One of the things that Robert Welch recognized that I don't think was as obvious back then as it is today now, because, today we have the internet, we have a lot more resources where people can do this research for themselves. But Robert Welch actually figured out, and along with some others, that subversives within the U.S. government had literally betrayed the free Chinese and deliberately sold China into slavery. There's many ways in which they did this, but essentially, in a nutshell, they did everything they could to betray Chiang Kai-shek, who had been our ally in World War II. I mean, even up to and including an arms embargo on the guy, demonizing him in the press. Meanwhile, doing everything they could to help Chairman Mao take over communist China.
Chiang Kai-shek, he was trying to institute a republic in China, right?
Yes, he was China's nationalist leader. So he was the leader of the Free Chinese. He was the leader of China during World War II. He was a very, very important ally for the U.S. during World War II. The Japanese had invaded and occupied enormous swaths of China. And Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the Chinese and the leader of the resistance against the Japanese occupation. So he was a very close ally of the U.S. government during World War II. And then instead of treating him as an ally, we had subversives within the U.S. government that did everything possible to throw him under the bus. They disarmed him. They put arms embargo on him. They gave the communists control of Manchuria. So, after World War II was coming to an end, the Japanese had enormous stockpiles of weaponry and supplies and ammunition in Manchuria. And subversives within the U.S. State Department and within the U.S. Defense Department orchestrated it so that Stalin could enter the war against Japan. After the Japanese were already begging to surrender, they essentially didn't do anything in the war against Japan. That was won by the blood of American soldiers, including my granddaddy, who was over there fighting the Japanese. And yet subversives within the US government made sure that Stalin could join right before the war ended, so that when it was over, Stalin could be one of the quote unquote victors entitled to, the quote unquote spoils. And they gave Manchuria over to communist occupation. And naturally, Stalin handed all of that Japanese weaponry, machinery, ammunition, supplies right to Chairman Mao and his mass murdering butchers, who of course were being presented to the American people as agrarian reformers, right? Oh, we just want to reform agriculture. That's no big deal. Of course, with help from the New York Times and other dishonest publications that obviously knew better. So that's kind of may God forgive us again. Again, may God forgive us in a nutshell. Is just the story of how subversives within the U.S. government, people like George Marshall, who served as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense and other important positions, made sure that China would fall to the communists and deliberately betrayed our ally, Chiang Kai-shek, who actually was him and Robert Welch knew each other personally. So.
Okay, and Chiang Kai-shek, within the United States, there was this concerted effort to, and Robert Welch wrote about this extensively, is that they used propaganda against him, saying he was, this incompetent, very corrupt leader of this Republican Party within China.
Yes, and so that was the propaganda, right? That Chiang Kai-shek was some sort of warlord, was some sort of strong man. And Robert Welch did not agree with every political view of Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was not as opposed to big government as, say, we might be, and he was not as opposed to maybe gun control as we might be, but he was anti-communist, and he was pro-America, and he was pro-liberty in a much greater sense than China had even historically been used to. So Chiang Kai-shek really was a defender of a free China. And he was demonized in the American press, again, as a strong man. And this was done with help from subversives within the State Department and within the Defense Department. A couple of important books came out painting him as some sort of monster, demonizing him, Red Star over China. Some of these were written by known communists and communist sympathizers, people affiliated with known front groups for the communist movement in the United States. And simultaneously, while Chiang Kai-shek, a very decent man, in my opinion, one of the great heroes of the 20th century, while he was being demonized, Chairman Mao was being praised and built up as some sort of hero. It really was an absolutely grotesque reversal of reality. And it didn't take long for Mao to show his true colors on the world stage. He slaughtered something like 80 million innocent human beings, enslaved the people of China, destroyed their cultural heritage. An absolute barbarian in the truest sense of the term. And yet, all the while, officials in the United States, many of whom we found out later were actual communists, some of them were even working for the Soviet government, were instrumental in bringing Chairman Mao to power.
So in the United States, obviously these infiltrators, they had to have positions of power. Could you describe how they were able to pull this off?
Yeah, well, one of the most important people in this whole process was George Marshall. And Senator McCarthy, who unfortunately gets a very bad name as a result of demonization by the communists. In fact, if anything, he underestimated the threat, the enormity of the problem of communist infiltration of U.S. institutions. And now we have documentation to prove that, like the decrypted Venona documents that were finally decrypted and revealed hundreds of Soviet agents up and down the U.S. government in very sensitive positions. But George Marshall was one of the most important people in this operation. He served in multiple different posts. He served as Secretary of Defense after World War II. He was also the Secretary of State from 1947 to about 1949. And even before that, he had served in an important role in the Army during the war, going all the way up to about 1945. And this guy was absolutely crucial to what happened with the betrayal of Chiang Kai-shek and the building up of Chairman Mao. And what was happening was communists would infiltrate the U.S. government, and then they would promote each other to higher and higher positions, and they would praise each other, and they would throw others under the bus. The U.S. Congress found out a lot about this. During the McCarthy hearings, we had the House Committee on Un-American Activities, we had the Senate Internal Security investigations. And so eventually a lot of this came out about how this worked. You know, you had communist agents all over Washington, D.C., in the intelligence community, in the State Department. I mean, just was absolutely packed with communist subversives. And so they would promote each other, and you know, in public, they would pretend to be good, patriotic Americans. And then at every possible opportunity, they would betray freedom fighters, and then they would promote communists. And, you know, we didn't see this only in Asia. We saw this very clearly also in Europe. You know, the people who were resisting handing all this new territory and all these new slaves to the communists were systematically demonized, removed from power, in some cases even died in highly suspicious circumstances. General Patton is an obvious example, right? After the Nazis were defeated, he said, hey, we ought to just go all the way to Moscow. And instead, what did foreign policy makers do? And there was a whole bunch of them, right? Not just George Marshall. There was Harry Dexter White at the Treasury. There was Alger Hiss, who was so instrumental in creating the United Nations. They basically gave half of Europe to Joseph Stalin, all of Eastern Europe, which was completely unnecessary, and big parts of Central Europe. We saw this all over Latin America. We saw this in Cuba, where the U.S. State Department was absolutely critical to bringing Castro to power. And even before this, we saw this going back all the way to the founding of the Soviet Union. There's a book actually sitting right behind me called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by historian Anthony Sutton, probably one of the most important historians of the 20th century. And he explains how very powerful elites in the United States, many of them mega bankers on Wall Street, you know, names that would be household names, helped finance the Bolshevik Revolution. So we have this long history of elites in the United States, some actually working for the communist movement, others working with the communist movement, deliberately aiding and abetting the rise to power of communist forces and deliberately betraying pro-America, pro-freedom governments and movements and peoples in favor of communists. And you know, the result was absolute tragedy all over the planet. You know, over half of the world's population at one point was enslaved under communist tyranny. And I mean, it's unfathomable that this could have happened, and yet it was happening, and it was happening as a direct result of the activities of subversives within the U.S. government.
Yeah, when we go back to World War II, right after that, the United States, it just got done fighting a massive war. You know, many lives were lost. The world was kind of in a state of trauma at that time. And so the United States and many other countries, you know, Western Europe, they were pretty much done fighting at the time. Do you think that how the communists were able to push this forward had a lot to do with just the combat fatigue of the Western world and fighting World War II, and they just wanted to pretty much get on with their lives? But then these communists, they use this weakness as an opportunity to push their agenda forward. And you know, they're throwing salt in our wounds and hitting us when we're down.
I think that was a big part of it. You know, the American people historically have not been pro-war. In fact, Americans really did not want to get involved, even in the world wars by and large. But there was also this problem of a lack of information. You know, the media had been controlled by the elites for quite some time. Actually, the Council on Foreign Relations and other organizations of the deep state had been very careful to buy up and get control over the key media organs. And so your average American had no idea that subversives within the U.S. government were busy all over the world boosting communism and stabbing freedom fighters in the back. If they had known, these people would have been run out of town. They would have been tarred and feathered. They would have been thrown in jail. And some of them did eventually get thrown in jail. You know, Alger Hiss, who we talked about last time I was on this program, too. Alger Hiss did end up going to jail for serving as an agent of Stalin and then lying about it. And he, of course, was the founder of the United Nations. So some of these people did end up getting caught. But I think the real problem was deception. You know, Americans were not used to dealing with that. Communism was this kind of new animal where there was no sense of morality, where the ends justifies the means, where slaughtering millions of people is seen as a valid tool to pursue, you know, whatever sick objectives the communists might have. And this was very alien to the American people. In fact, it's alien to Western civilization and you know, what was called Christendom at one time. It just would have been inconceivable. And so, you know, a big part of it, I think, was the ignorance of the American people. If they had known this was happening, they never would have accepted it. They never would have gone for it. And you know, we saw people rallied behind, for example, Joe McCarthy. When he tried to shine the light on these things, people rallied behind him. But the communists were very powerful, and they're very powerful allies, non-communist allies. I have another book sitting behind me, Tim. It's called Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. This is a guy who, was very, very familiar with and intimate with what he called the Anglo-American establishment. He talked about secret societies formed by a guy called Cecil Rhodes, billionaire mining magnate who made his fortune in Southern Africa, actually was backed by the Rothschild dynasty. And in this book, Tragedy and Hope, he talks about this network, and he admits that he has no aversion to it. He actually agrees with many of their aims, and he points out in the book that they work very similar to how the right believes communists work, right, in terms of subversion and sneaking around. And he said, actually, this network often cooperates with communists. I mean, this is a bombshell revelation. And this is not just some fly-by-night. This is a guy that served as Bill Clinton's mentor. Actually, Bill Clinton thanked him when he was elected president for being his mentor at Georgetown University. So that gives you a sense, there's been so much more going on behind the scenes for generations now. And a lot of this is still not public knowledge. It is now available publicly. The problem is you won't see it in the fake media. You won't see it in the fake newspapers. And so a lot of people don't realize these things yet. But it is now public knowledge that very powerful elites in the United States and in the Western world, even if they may not have been ideological communists, were certainly very happy to work with communists to advance their subversive objectives. And I think that's true of the broader communist movement too. I think there's still a misconception, not just in the United States, but around the world, that communists, at the upper levels actually believe this. There's people who think Stalin was an actual communist, that he really believed in these things, or that Lenin was an actual communist, or any of these people, Castro. And I think the reality is that's preposterous. The idea that Stalin truly believed in all this nonsense about equality and so on, it's just a cover story for a criminal conspiracy, right? And they need a cover story. They need useful idiots, and you can't really attract useful idiots if you say, hey, we just want to slaughter people and enslave people. So they came up with this cover story of, equality and getting the best deal for workers and ending exploitation by capitalists. But it was all a cover story, and it was only possible because of the ignorance of the American people and the people of the world.
Yeah, that's very interesting. One thing Robert Welch stated in his book that I thought was really interesting was that communism cannot sustain itself on its own. And it always needs this outside assistance, or it will quickly collapse. And you were talking about large financial donors. Do you think that, from all your research, do you think that's a correct statement?
Oh, no question about it. I mean, communism is, from an economic perspective, absolutely idiotic. I teach this to my economics students. When you have a centrally planned economy, you have no objective way of determining whether what you're doing even makes sense, right? You may be destroying wealth under the guise of producing something and not even realize it, because in a free market economy, you have prices, right? Prices will tell you if the resources, the labor, the raw materials that you're taking and turning into something, whether the resources were more valuable or whether the final product is more valuable in terms of how much people value it, right? Because if you're taking $400 worth of wood, paint, nails, and glue and turning it into tables that are selling for $800, hey, people are happy about me turning these resources into tables, right? I'm earning $400 worth of profit. I'm adding $400 worth of value to these materials by turning them from raw materials into tables. Whereas if you're turning $400 worth of wood, nails, paint, and glue into something that's worth $200, then you're destroying wealth, right? You're destroying $200 worth of wealth every time you make a table. So when you have a market system, you have prices, and you have an objective way of determining whether what you're doing makes sense, whether it creates or destroys wealth. Well, in a centrally planned system, you don't have that, right? You have no objective way of determining that. And so what happens almost in every case that we've ever seen, when communists really engage in central planning, they end up destroying wealth more often than they end up creating wealth. Right, and the little bit of wealth that they do end up creating goes into lavish lifestyles for the elites and heavy military spending. So communism as an economic system is just absolutely absurd. It's so backwards, it doesn't work. Anybody who doubts that can take a trip to Cuba or North Korea. Millions of people have starved just in the last few decades. So clearly, from an economic point of view, it's absolutely idiotic. The only way that these systems have been able to survive is by leeching off of economies where there is still some semblance of a free market, primarily the United States. And this has been true all along. The Soviet Union was bailed out time and time and time again by the American taxpayer. This was true during World War II. I mean, we built Stalin's entire war machine. We built the factories that were producing the trucks and the planes and the tanks and the bombs and the guns. And that was all American ingenuity with American money. We gave them the technology. We gave them the know-how. We gave them the supplies. We gave them the raw materials. And this has been true everywhere, and it continues to be true, right? North Korea continues getting these enormous infusions of Western tax money through the United Nations. I just wrote an article the other day in the New American about the UN spending gazillions of dollars fighting global warming in North Korea, right? It's absolutely insane. They're not fighting global warming. They're propping up a backwards dictatorship that couldn't feed its people if it actually even tried. And so this is what we've seen everywhere. Now, China is an interesting case because China economically was so backwards that you literally had millions of people starving as a result of failed central planning. Now, today, people look at China and they say, well, China's kind of prosperous, right? Well, yes. And now they don't have a completely command economy today anymore. In fact, they're now moving toward more of a technocracy while allowing some market mechanisms to remain in place that actually do make it possible to have rational allocations of capital. And in addition to that, they're stealing all Western technology. They're stealing Western know-how. They're stealing Western intellectual property. They're forcing American companies that want to come in and do business in China to join joint ventures and hand over all their intellectual property. So China is still not, a prosperous economy in any sense of the term. It's true they're good at stealing our stuff now, and they're good at subverting the United States, and they're good at drawing manufacturing there because hey, they have slave labor, right? It's hard for an American to compete with slave wages when you have a massive slave labor force. But communism as an economic system is absolutely ridiculous, and it would not be able to exist without mooching off of a free market system.
Well, let's go back in time. Let's say hypothetically, what would the world look like today, in your opinion, if we backed people like Chiang Kai-shek, supported MacArthur, General MacArthur, in the Pacific Theater? He was fired by Truman at the behest of Dean Acheson. He was the Secretary of State at the time. And Dean Acheson, he was promoting the communist agenda. He was kind of the Grima Wormtongue to Harry Truman. And so, well, let's just say we supported Chiang Kai-shek. Let's say we heeded Welch's warning. What would the world look like at that point? Just so, people that believe in socialism, communism can get an idea. Let's paint a picture here of what the world will look like if it did not exist.
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, I don't think we would have even needed to have supported Chiang Kai-shek. Just not actively sabotaging him and supporting the communists, Chiang Kai-shek would have been able to wipe the floor with them. I mean, the communists were, a ragtag band of lunatics. And without American support and without deliberate American betrayal of Chiang Kai-shek, the communists never would have been able to take over China. It would have been impossible. The same thing is true for Cuba. And so what would the world have looked like if the U.S. government, if subversive elements within the U.S. government had not actively intervened on behalf of the communists? Well, I think very simple. It would have been a much better place. We'd have probably hundreds of millions of people alive today. In fact, probably even more than that. I mean, the communist Chinese alone have butchered something like 300 million unborn children in their quest to enforce this grotesque one-child policy, and maybe even higher than that. So there would be hundreds of millions of additional people alive on the planet today. Massive amounts of additional wealth would have been created rather than had been destroyed. The world would not be facing the kind of threat from totalitarianism that it continues to face to this day, in terms of these globalist institutions that are becoming more and more autocratic, in terms of communist China now posing a security risk to the whole world, now trying to bring all these new countries under its control through the One Belt, One Road initiative. So, in short, the world would look like a much better place, a much more prosperous place. There would be more people around, and these people, would have contributed to society. Maybe they would have cured cancer. Maybe they would have come up with inventions that would have made our lives easier. But instead, we still deal with the after effects of this. And you know, if you visit any country that was communist, I mean, I just, you know, in the last 10 years or so, I've been to many former communist countries. I was in Ukraine last year. I was in Russia a few years before that. And what you see is that, you know, generations of communism has done incredible damage to these peoples, to these nations. And I don't know whether they'll ever recover from that. You know, the corruption, the lack of morality, the destruction of the family, the widespread suicides, the drug abuse, the declining populations, you know, the demoralization of these people, the total destruction of their traditional culture, their traditional norms, their family structure. You know, the damage is just impossible to calculate. It's so huge. So, you know, I think very clearly the world would be much better, but I think it's hard to even imagine how much better it would have looked like. It's a difficult thought experiment because the damage, the horror unleashed by the communists and the people who backed them is just incalculable. I don't think a mind can even begin to comprehend the human suffering that was unleashed as a result of this that would not have existed had it not been for this.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine for us here in the United States to really grasp that kind of horror. And so Robert Welch, he was in a sense trying to keep us from having to live out that experience, because in the communist agenda, China was basically going to be, as you stated in many articles, they wanted to be the leader of the New World Order. And so where does the United States fit into this New World Order? How did they see that?
Well, it seems to me like, you know, and just to clarify, to start with, for the people who don't hear that term much, or for the people who have been watching too much fake news, you know, New World Order is a term that is regularly used by elites around the world to describe the kind of global system that they're trying to build. Now, if you go on YouTube, you'll find endless numbers of videos. You'll find George H.W. Bush defining it as a world in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to bring about the vision of the UN's founders, which of course were Stalin and Alger Hiss, right? Two communist peas in a pod, like we talked about last time I was on this program. Then you have Bill Clinton talking about how great the New World Order is going to be. You have Joe Biden talking about it, Henry Kissinger, David Cameron. You know, so many people have talked about this New World Order. And essentially, I think George H.W. Bush painted the clearest picture. It's a global government controlled by the UN. And it's very clear at this point that they're hoping that communist China will play a leading role, if not the star role, in this New World Order. And you know, to a lot of people, this has been clear for quite some time now. But at this point, they barely even bother to hide it anymore. And I'll give you some examples of some of the data that we have on this. So David Rockefeller, you know, this is a guy who was instrumental in the leadership of the Council on Foreign Relations, a guy who founded the Trilateral Commission, a guy who's been on the steering committee of Bilderberg. You know, this is a guy who is the very definition of the deep state, right? They all joke is, why doesn't David Rockefeller run for president? Well, you know, he doesn't want a demotion, right? And so this is a very, very powerful person. This is a guy who admitted in his own autobiography that, in his own words, he is a conspirator. That's the word he used, working with a secret cabal against the best interests of his own country to form a one world political and economic order. Those are his words from his own autobiography. I guess he figured not many normal people were going to read it, and he was probably right. But that's what he said, right? And he went to communist China back in the early 1970s, back when it was inconceivable for a normal American to go to communist China, right? Millions of people were being slaughtered. So David Rockefeller goes over there, comes back and writes an op-ed in the New York Times, and this is still on the New York Times' website today. Anybody can go read this. I think the title was News from a China Traveler or something like that. I forget the exact title, the headline. But he writes in there, and this is a direct quote, that the social experiment under Chairman Mao is one of the most important and successful in all of human history. Now, what kind of monster, what kind of savage thinks that exterminating 50 million people is a good social experiment, is in fact one of the best social experiments in all of human history? You've got to be a monster to believe something like that.
Yeah.
And yet that's what he wrote in his own words in the New York Times. Continuing to more recently, you had George Soros, you know, another one of these globalist billionaires, deep state operatives. This guy has said on multiple occasions that he thinks China ought to own the New World Order in the same way that the United States owned the current world order. He said communist China has a better functioning government than the United States. And, you know, if you think mass murder and population control and putting Christians in prison and tearing down churches and chopping organs out of political prisoners, I mean, if you think that's a good government, hey, yeah, communist China is doing great, right? But if you believe in civilized standards, if you believe in individual liberty, if you believe in limits on government, if you believe that individuals are made in the image of God and have inherent worth and dignity, then, you know, by any standard, communist China has a horrifying government. And so we know that they want China at the center of this new world order. We know that the model they use there now, which I think has been very properly described as technocracy, is the kind of model they want for the world. And so what happens then to the United States in this picture? Well, I think, put very simply, the United States as a national ideal and potentially even as a nation ceases to exist. Now, there are a few things that make America unique, that really define America. And, you know, this is partly our godly heritage, our heritage of liberty, going back to, you know, the Pilgrims and even the people who settled in Jamestown in Virginia. And then even to our founding, you know, as an independent nation, our Declaration of Independence, unprecedented in human history. They said, God gives us rights. They said, God created us all equally. God has endowed us with inalienable rights. Therefore, government has no right to infringe on these rights. In fact, we establish governments to protect these rights. And this was a product of biblical thinking. You know, God said, thou shalt not murder. And so extrapolated, that means you have a right to life, right? Only God can take away your life, not government. And God said, thou shalt not steal. So you reason from there. You say, well, that means everybody has a right to private property. That means government doesn't get to steal your property, and government has an obligation to help you protect your private property. This was a unique idea in human history. And the globalists who want to build this new world order hate these ideas with an absolute passion, and they will do anything and everything to wipe these ideas off the face of the earth. They're doing a very good job of it. If you talk to the average American, they don't even know these things anymore. They went to a public school. They were taught a completely fraudulent version of history. And so, you know, even Americans don't know these things anymore, much less people in other parts of the world. And so what is going to happen if these people get their way is America will continue its steady decline. And by that, I mean economically, politically, spiritually, morally, technologically, academically, intellectually, every possible way. We will continue our downward trajectory. Meanwhile, hostile foreign governments that are based on essentially opposite principles, right? You have no inherent value. You have no inherent dignity. You're a cog in the machine. You get no rights whatsoever. Think communist China. These are the regimes that will be ascendant. And yes, right now they're using our money, they're using our know-how, they're using our technology, they're using our military to bring this vision about. But once they're done with America, they fully intend to dismantle it in a very real sense. And, you know, I think we're starting to see some of that. It is my opinion that Donald Trump represented kind of like a pushing of a pause button on the terminal decline of the United States. I hope this terminal decline can be reversed, but at this point, I think it's still an open question. But in the New World Order, I think there's going to be a very, very diminished role for the United States, if there's any role at all. And, you know, it's not only me who says these things. The director of policy and planning on the National Security Council under the Trump administration, his name was Rich Higgins. He was actually fired by a deep state swamp creature, but he put together a phenomenal memo, the Higgins memo, where he talked about the deep state wants to turn government into basically God bestriding the earth. And as part of that objective, they need to completely eradicate the United States, not just as a nation, but also as an ideal, you know, these ideas that our country was based on. And I think that is what is the ultimate objective, is to bring humanity under the control of a single global authority, which will probably be pursued, first of all, using these regional authorities like the European Union, the African Union. Putin right now is building the Eurasian Union, the Latin American communists were building the Union of South American States. And so eventually merging this all into a one world system with America, you know, nothing but maybe a bygone memory, and potentially even held up as an example of why freedom is so terrible. You know, if they could spark a civil war here, if they can, you know, define America as basically slavery and civil war and guns and, you know, other horrors, and they put that in the history books, you know, that would be essentially the end of America as a nation and as an ideal. And I think that is ultimately the goal, to build up regimes like China and have them take over the mechanisms of global governance, and to have America in terminal decline.
Yeah, interesting. And we have figures like Bernie Sanders, and this is what is interesting, is, you know, he says he's, you know, very against the Chinese Communist Party and its human rights abuses. But then again, he's very supportive of the tools needed to create that type of situation. So what do you have to say about this? In terms of the seductiveness of socialism and communism, and what people have used to create this, these situations. Well, basically, oftentimes in communism and socialism, they will destroy something. They'll create a scenario where there needs to be more government, where the government will step in and take care of things. They do that quite often. And here in the United States, we're seeing this decline. You talk extensively of education. So we're looking at millennials that, they're seeing these rising costs of higher education, everything like that. So a whole generation is essentially feeling this decline. And so we want government to step in. Do you think this is a tool in the tool belt of communist socialists? And what would you say to people that are supporting Bernie Sanders? Do you think his policies are pushing this agenda? Or do you think he's really standing up against it, like a lot of people think?
Yeah, I think Bolshevik Bernie is an absolute tool of the deep state of the communists. Yeah, I think that much is clear. And you hit on some really important points in your question. I think at this point, if current trajectories hold, it is almost inevitable that America will become a socialist nation. If you look at the polling data, 70% of millennials, according to a recent poll by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, 70% of millennials said they're going to vote for socialist candidates. As millennials become, the generation that's in power, and as older generations die off and go into, old folks' homes and become less politically relevant, socialists will come to dominate. And this was all brought about through lies and through the public education system. Karl Marx understood. He was a very smart guy. He was very evil. I mean, just wicked to the core. But he was very smart. And he understood, like many, many other communists before him, that the key, and socialists as well. I mean, Adolf Hitler, for example, a National Socialist, also understood that the key to victory was brainwashing the youth, right? So Karl Marx was an advocate. If you read the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, one of the 10 planks was having government control of education. And that is now what we have in the United States today. And it's been an incredibly effective tool. And I would argue the most important tool, the most important single tool in moving us in that direction. So the public education system has now dumbed down the American population, and it's indisputable. I mean, the government's own data shows this absolutely clearly. It has also indoctrinated the American population to the point where we don't know, to quote ancient Chinese wisdom from Sun Tzu in The Art of War, you'll win every battle if you know yourself and your enemy. If you don't know yourself and you don't know your enemy, you're going to lose every battle. And that's where the American people are today. They have no idea who they are. They don't know their heritage. They don't know their history. They don't know their constitution. They don't even know the principles upon which their nation was founded. All they know is lies that were regurgitated by government school teachers in government schools, and that are then reinforced through Hollywood and the fake news and the propaganda machine that is the media establishment. So we don't know ourselves, and we don't know our enemy, right? They've got us thinking that the enemy is Democrats or Republicans or black people or white people or Jews, or pick your thing, just to get everybody divided amongst themselves and bickering amongst themselves, so that the elites, the real establishment. And I think there's also a sense in which this is a spiritual battle where we have really evil, and I mean evil, absolute evil, on one side. And so the American people don't recognize this. They're just completely clueless. And this was brought about through the public education system. I am a firm believer that another generation of, the great majority of Americans, right now it's something like 85 to 87% of American children are in government schools. I think another generation of this, and America will be doomed. Absent some kind of divine intervention, some kind of miraculous intervention by God himself, I don't see any hope for America if we let this go on for another generation. It's been going on for generations, and we've seen the effect that it has. We saw what it did in Germany. We saw what it did in the Soviet Union. We see what it's done to Cuba, right? We see what it's done to North Korea. I mean, North Korea is an absolute freak show. These people are just brainwashed beyond comprehension. And this was done as a result of the government hijacking the education system and hijacking the media. That is the power of these manipulation tools. And it would be a terrible thing for America to go down that path, but unfortunately we are going down that path. And pretending like it's not happening, that's not going to fix the problem. So we need to be honest about this. We need to discuss it openly, and we need to treat this as an urgent situation. I mean, if you have cancer, you don't want to just pretend like you don't have it and just continue doing what you're doing. You've got to take action steps to deal with it. And I think that's where we are right now as a nation here in America.
Yeah, so these are major issues you talked about. And as you stated, this is as much of an issue for us now as it was in Robert Welch's time, the 1950s, 1960s. So hopefully we're more informed, prepared, and willing to face this challenge once again here, and hopefully for the last time.
I hope so. Oh my goodness. I mean, it's been so tragic that just words can't even begin to describe the horror and the suffering unleashed by these communists and by the people who supported them. And so, I pray that God would forgive us, and that God would help us to ensure that this doesn't happen anymore. So,
Okay. Well, Alex Newman, again, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
thank you so much for having me, Tim. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the listeners for tuning in.